Liberal talk show host tries to humiliate Clint Eastwood, but his epic clapback goes viral. We dream of reaching 1,000 subscribers by the end of February. Subscribe to the channel and be part of this dream too. The lights of the television studio gleamed brightly, casting a glow on the sleek, modern set of the Progressive Pulse, one of the most watched liberal talk shows in America. The audience, a carefully curated mix of young activists, academics, and socially conscious celebrities, sat in eager anticipation as the show's charismatic host, Veronica Hayes, prepped for what was promised to be a thought-provoking interview. Veronica had built her reputation on challenging the establishment, calling out hypocrisy, and most notably, dismantling conservative figures with her sharp wit and unrelenting questions. Tonight, however, she was facing an entirely different kind of guest. Clint Eastwood, a Hollywood legend, a conservative icon, and a man known for his no-nonsense demeanor. His mere presence on her show was already making waves, and Veronica saw this as her golden opportunity to expose him as outdated, out of touch, and perhaps even regressive in his views. The tension in the air was palpable, a silent battle of ideologies brewing before the first words were even spoken. As the camera zoomed in on Veronica's poised, confident expression, she adjusted the notes on her lap, her manicured fingers tracing the key questions she had meticulously prepared. The goal was simple: corner Eastwood into either admitting that his conservative views were antiquated or forcing him into a defensive stumble that would go viral. Across from her, the legendary actor and director sat with a relaxed, almost amused expression, dressed in a simple yet elegant dark blue suit. Unlike other guests who often squirmed under the weight of Veronica's relentless interrogations, Eastwood exuded the calm of a man who had faced much bigger battles, both on screen and in real life. "Mr. Eastwood," Veronica began, her voice smooth but laced with an unmistakable edge, "you've had an incredible career spanning decades. But in a time when Hollywood is striving for inclusivity, progress, and social responsibility, many see your films and political statements as relics of a bygone era. Do you think your legacy will hold up in this new world? Or are you simply refusing to evolve with the times?" A murmur of approval rippled through the audience, some nodding, others already anticipating a moment of verbal takedown. For a brief moment, Eastwood simply looked at her, his piercing gaze unreadable. Then, with the slow, deliberate cadence that had become his signature, he leaned forward slightly and said, "You know, I've been around long enough to know that every generation believes they've reinvented the world. They think they've discovered something brand new, something revolutionary, and they want to erase everything that came before them. But the truth is, what lasts isn't dictated by what's trending today. It's determined by what still resonates decades from now. So if my films, my stories, my principles still speak to people, then I don't need to evolve just to fit a narrative. Good storytelling doesn't have an expiration date." His words, spoken with quiet conviction, sent a ripple of silence through the crowd. Veronica, momentarily caught off guard by his unshakable confidence, quickly composed herself. "But don't you think," she pressed, "that refusing to acknowledge changing social dynamics is part of the problem? Progress requires adaptation, doesn't it?" Her voice was firm, but there was a subtle urgency now, as if she needed to regain control of the conversation before it slipped too far out of her hands. Eastwood let out a small, knowing chuckle, shaking his head slightly. "Progress isn't about erasing the past or demonizing those who built the foundations you now stand on," he said. "It's about learning from history, not rewriting it. People love to pretend that wisdom only exists in the present moment, but that's a dangerous illusion. The real test of progress is whether people can respect differing viewpoints without resorting to vilification. You can challenge ideas, but when you start trying to destroy the people who hold them, you've already lost the battle." His words hung in the air, cutting through the scripted nature of the show, the curated applause cues, the orchestrated outrage. Veronica, for the first time in a long while, felt a shift she hadn't anticipated. This wasn't just another conservative guest to be cornered into a headline-worthy blunder. This was Clint Eastwood, unapologetic, unwavering, and absolutely unafraid. The audience, so used to cheering Veronica's verbal takedowns, now found themselves in an unfamiliar place, listening. And just like that, the battle of wits had truly begun. Veronica Hayes was not one to be easily shaken. She had built her career dismantling ideological opponents, often reducing them to hesitant stammers and defensive justifications. Yet, as she studied Clint Eastwood's calm demeanor, she realized he was an entirely different breed. He wasn't defensive, nor was he eager to please. He simply existed in his own certainty, unbothered by the cultural tides that so often dictated the pulse of public discourse. But Veronica was a master at turning conversations to her advantage. She leaned forward slightly, a calculated move that signaled engagement and control. "Mr. Eastwood, I respect your legacy," she began, her voice dripping with professional courtesy. "But let's be honest, many of your past statements on politics and social issues have been, well, controversial. You've spoken about toughness and individual responsibility, ideas that many believe undermine the systemic struggles faced by marginalized communities. Do you think your philosophy is out of touch with the real struggles people face today?" She knew the question was a trap, phrased in a way that any response could be weaponized against him. The audience murmured in anticipation, eager for her to land the first real blow. Eastwood didn't flinch. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, his signature half-smirk appearing at the corner of his mouth. "You know," he said slowly, "when I was coming up in this business, we didn't have the luxury of waiting for the world to roll out a red carpet for us. You had to make your own way, earn your own respect. I don't dismiss anyone's struggles, but I do believe that strength comes from what you overcome, not from what people hand you. You call that controversial. I call it reality." The audience, usually quick to erupt in applause at Veronica's takedowns, was momentarily caught in a strange limbo. Some nodded in agreement. Others looked to Veronica, waiting for her to regain control. But Eastwood wasn't finished. "The real problem isn't toughness," he continued. "It's that we're teaching people to resent the very things that build resilience. I've seen generations before us come through war, economic collapse, real hardship, and they didn't ask for safe spaces, they built their own futures. I guess the question is, are we raising people to be strong, or are we convincing them they're already defeated before they even try?" Veronica exhaled slowly, careful not to let her frustration show. Eastwood wasn't just answering her questions. He was reframing them, shifting the battleground from culture wars to something deeper, fundamental human resilience. This was dangerous territory for her usual approach, where moral superiority was her sharpest weapon. She needed to regain control. "But don't you think," she countered, "that dismissing systemic issues ignores the fact that not everyone starts from the same place? That some people have advantages others don't?" This was her moment to pivot, to bring the conversation back into familiar, favorable terrain. She knew that in today's climate, acknowledging privilege was the foundation of every progressive argument. "You've had an incredible career, Mr. Eastwood," she added, her voice tinged with a knowing undertone. "But don't you think that maybe, just maybe, your perspective is shaped by a level of privilege that others don't have?" Eastwood chuckled softly, shaking his head as he leaned back in his chair. "Privilege," he repeated, as if tasting the word. "I came from a working-class family. I dug ditches, washed dishes, served in the military. Nothing was handed to me. What I had was drive, and no amount of privilege or lack of it could take that away from me. You see, the problem with this word privilege is that it's being used as an excuse to divide people, to convince them that their struggle is someone else's fault. But life isn't fair to anyone. It wasn't fair to the kid who grew up poor in the 1940s. It wasn't fair to the men who fought in Vietnam. And it sure as hell isn't fair today. The difference is what you do about it." He let his words settle, scanning the crowd, reading their silent reactions. Then, with a slow, deliberate nod, he added, "The moment you stop waiting for the world to be fair is the moment you actually start living." A hush fell over the room, and for the first time, Veronica felt something she hadn't expected, a shift. The audience, conditioned to cheer for ideological takedowns, was instead absorbing the weight of his words. And for Veronica, the real battle had just begun. Veronica tightened her grip on the cue cards in her lap, though she knew she couldn't afford to appear flustered. This was her domain, her battlefield, and she wasn't about to let Clint Eastwood, a man who had built his career in an era long past, outmaneuver her in front of her own audience. She straightened her shoulders and met his unwavering gaze. "That's a powerful sentiment, Mr. Eastwood," she acknowledged, her tone measured. "But don't you think that perspective comes from a place of personal success? I mean, it's easy to say, just work hard when you've already made it. But what about the people who don't have that opportunity? The ones who are marginalized, discriminated against, systemically held back?" Her words were carefully chosen, each syllable aimed at resonating with her audience. If she could shift the conversation back to social justice and inequity, she could regain control of the narrative. Eastwood studied her for a moment, the ghost of a smirk playing at his lips. He wasn't rattled. If anything, he looked almost amused by her persistence. "Opportunity isn't something you're given," he said finally, his voice steady. "It's something you recognize and fight for. I didn't get my first break because Hollywood was waiting for me. I had to prove I was worth the risk. That's how life works. No one is going to hand you a fair deal just because you demand it." He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice just enough to make the moment feel intimate, weighty. "The real problem isn't that people don't have opportunities. It's that they're being told they don't. That's the biggest lie of all." Veronica's jaw tightened. He was good. Too good. Every attempt to paint him as out of touch, as someone who didn't understand the struggles of the modern world, was met with calm logic. And worse, the audience was listening. Not just politely, genuinely, intently. She needed to push harder. "So, you're saying systemic issues don't exist?" She pressed, her voice gaining an edge. "That racism, sexism, economic disparity, they're all just excuses?" This was it, the moment where most guests would falter, caught between the fear of offending and the need to defend themselves. It was a trap she had set a dozen times before, and it never failed. But Eastwood didn't falter. He didn't even blink. Instead, he exhaled a slow breath, shaking his head slightly. "You see, that's the problem with these conversations," he said. "It's always one extreme or the other. Either the system is entirely to blame, or personal responsibility is. But life doesn't work in absolutes. Are there challenges? Of course. Are there unfair obstacles? Absolutely. But the question isn't whether the world is unfair. The question is what you do about it. Do you let it define you? Do you let it stop you? Or do you push forward anyway?" His voice carried a quiet conviction, the kind that came from experience, not theory. "I didn't grow up in privilege. I wasn't given anything. But I never wasted time blaming the system. I was too busy working." He paused, letting the words settle. "You can focus on what holds you back, or you can focus on what moves you forward. The choice is always yours." Silence. A rare, unexpected silence. Veronica could feel it, could sense the shift in the air. The audience, her audience, wasn't just waiting for her response. They were considering his words. And for the first time in her career, she felt something foreign, something unsettling. The possibility that she wasn't winning this debate. She squared her shoulders, forced a smile, and prepared for her next move. She wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. Veronica inhaled deeply, masking her unease with the poise of a seasoned broadcaster. She had sparred with politicians, corporate moguls, and Hollywood elite, but Clint Eastwood was proving to be unlike any guest she had ever faced. He wasn't flustered, defensive, or eager to please. He was a man who had seen the tides of culture shift 100 times and remained standing. And worse, he wasn't losing the audience. She needed to steer the conversation back into her territory, to reclaim the momentum before he dismantled every argument she had so carefully prepared. She adjusted in her chair, letting a calculated smirk creep onto her face. "You talk about personal responsibility and resilience," she said smoothly. "But let's be honest, Mr. Eastwood. The America you came up in is not the America we live in today. Back then, you didn't have social media holding people accountable. You didn't have entire movements dedicated to calling out inequality and demanding change. Do you think if you were starting out in this industry today, you'd have the same opportunities? Or do you think your views would get you canceled before you even had a chance?" She arched an eyebrow, the word canceled hanging in the air like a loaded gun. A low murmur spread through the audience. This was what they had been waiting for. The defining moment where she cornered him, forced him into an admission that he was a relic of a past that no longer had a place in modern society. The audience had seen it before, time and time again. But Eastwood? He just chuckled. A deep, rumbling, almost amused sound. Canceled, he repeated, as if tasting the word. You know, back in my day, we called that something else. We called it censorship, and it never aged well. He let the words linger, watching as the weight of them settled. This industry, this country, they've always had gatekeepers. People who decide who gets to have a voice and who doesn't. But the funny thing about truth is it doesn't need permission to exist. It finds a way. And the people who try to silence it, they always end up on the wrong side of history. The audience, which had been waiting for Veronica to take him down, found themselves caught in an unexpected moment of contemplation. This wasn't the canned outrage they were used to. This wasn't a guest scrambling to defend himself. This was a man who had lived long enough to see the cycles repeat, who spoke not from theory, but from a lifetime of experience. And in that moment, it became clear, Clint Eastwood wasn't here to be canceled. He was here to remind them why he never could be. Veronica, sensing the shift, leaned in, her voice sharpening. So, you don't believe in accountability? She pressed. You don't think people in positions of influence should be called out when they say or do something harmful? She gestured toward the cameras, toward the unseen millions watching from their homes. Because that's what this is about, Mr. Eastwood. People want to hold others accountable. They want a world where power doesn't go unchecked. Eastwood's expression didn't change. If anything, he looked more amused than before. Accountability, he said slowly, isn't the same as erasing people you disagree with. You want to challenge ideas? Fine. That's how progress happens. But what we're seeing now isn't accountability. It's selective outrage. It's people deciding that anything that doesn't fit their current worldview needs to be destroyed. He shifted in his seat, locking eyes with her. But here's the thing about real progress. It doesn't come from silencing people. It comes from being willing to listen, even when you don't like what you hear. For the first time, Veronica didn't have an immediate rebuttal. Not because she didn't have something to say, but because she could feel it. The shift. The slow but undeniable realization that, for once, the audience wasn't hanging on her words. They were hanging on his. And in that moment, she knew this wasn't just an interview. It was something bigger, something that would be talked about long after the cameras stopped rolling. And for the first time in her career, she wasn't sure if she was winning. Veronica felt an unfamiliar sensation creeping in, a loss of control. This was her show, her platform. Yet Clint Eastwood was dictating the rhythm of the conversation with an ease that was both infuriating and, in some ways, admirable. She had debated some of the sharpest minds in politics and entertainment, but this was different. He wasn't playing defense. He wasn't scrambling to appease. He was simply being unshaken by the weight of public perception. And for the first time in a long time, she felt the gravity of someone who didn't need to win over a crowd because he already knew where he stood. But she wasn't going to let him walk away unchallenged. She straightened her posture, her voice taking on a sharper edge. So let me get this straight, Mr. Eastwood. You think people are just too sensitive now? That calling out injustice, demanding fairness, holding people accountable, those are all just signs of weakness. The question was designed to stir the audience, to reignite the energy that had been slowly slipping from her grasp. She needed a moment, a soundbite that could be clipped, shared, and weaponized against him. This was about control, and she was determined to take it back. Eastwood sighed, shaking his head slightly, as if he had heard this argument 1,000 times before. No, he said plainly. What I think is that people confuse justice with revenge. They don't want accountability. They want payback. They want to tear things down just to feel like they've done something. He leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. Real justice isn't about destroying the past. It's about learning from it. And you can't learn from something you've erased. A hush settled over the studio. Veronica could feel it, the weight of his words, the way they cut through the noise. She needed to push harder, to break through his steady composure before he completely turned the tide against her. But don't you think, she countered, That some things should be torn down? That some voices should be silenced? Hate speech, bigotry, outdated ideas that harm people. Should we really just let them exist unchecked? She knew this was the moment to trap him. If he defended free speech too strongly, he'd be labeled as siding with the oppressors. If he conceded, he'd betray his own principles. It was the perfect corner. Eastwood chuckled, not nervously, not in frustration, but as if he had expected this exact moment. He said, I come from a time when the same people who talk about tolerance today were the ones trying to ban rock music, censor movies, and tell artists what they could and couldn't say. The faces change, but the mindset stays the same. Every generation thinks they've found the perfect moral compass, that they alone have the right to decide who gets to speak and who doesn't. He let out a small breath, shaking his head. But the truth is, when you start deciding that some voices don't deserve to be heard, it's only a matter of time before someone decides the same about you. The silence was no longer just a pause. It was something heavier, something more profound. Veronica had never experienced this on her show before. An audience that wasn't just reacting, but rethinking. The energy in the room had shifted entirely, and she knew, deep down, that this interview was no longer about taking down Clint Eastwood. It was about whether or not she had underestimated him. The atmosphere in the studio was no longer charged with the eager anticipation of a takedown. Instead, it had settled into something far more unpredictable. The audience, so often Veronica's greatest asset, was no longer fully in her corner. They weren't heckling Eastwood, they weren't laughing at his words, and most importantly, they weren't waiting for her to land the final blow. They were listening. Veronica felt the shift, but she couldn't afford to acknowledge it. Instead, she pressed forward, her voice carefully modulated. Mr. Eastwood, I think we can both agree that free speech is important. But don't you think that in today's world, where words have real consequences, people need to be held accountable for the things they say? We've seen public figures make comments that have led to real harm. Isn't there a responsibility to ensure that rhetoric doesn't cross the line into dangerous territory? Eastwood exhaled slowly, as if he had expected this very question. Of course, words have consequences, he said, nodding. They always have. That's why people used to be taught to think before they spoke. The difference now is that people aren't just punished for what they say, they're punished for what others think they meant. Intent doesn't matter anymore. Context doesn't matter. A joke from 30 years ago, a comment taken out of context. People want blood, not understanding. He shook his head. You say it's about accountability, but let's be honest, it's about control. The audience was motionless. Even the camera crew, who were usually immune to the debates unfolding on stage, seemed captivated. Veronica felt the moment slipping further from her grasp, but she couldn't let him take full control. She leaned forward, her voice more urgent now. So, are you saying there should be no consequences for what people say? That public figure should be able to say anything they want, no matter how offensive or harmful, without repercussions. Eastwood's smirk returned, slow and knowing. Repercussions, he repeated, or retribution? His voice was steady, unshaken. Because those are two very different things. If someone says something truly harmful, let people respond. Let them challenge it, debate it, expose it for what it is. But when you start deciding that people should be erased for saying the wrong thing, that's not justice, that's fear. He let his words settle, then added, and the people demanding that kind of control, they never stop at just one voice. They always find a new enemy. The silence was deafening. The audience, so used to being prompted to react, sat in an uneasy stillness. Veronica felt the walls closing in, but before she could regain control, a new force entered the room: the internet. Within seconds, clips of the exchange were being uploaded, tweeted, and dissected in real time. Hashtags began trending before the interview had even ended. Some hailed Eastwood's words as the voice of reason in an age of hysteria. Others accused him of being dismissive, out of touch. But regardless of what side people fell on, one truth was undeniable. This moment had gone viral. Veronica knew what that meant. She had been at the center of viral moments before, had built a career on them. But this was different. This wasn't a triumphant clip of her dismantling a guest. This wasn't a neatly packaged moment of ideological victory. This was bigger, messier, and entirely out of her control. And for the first time in her career, she wasn't sure if that was a good thing. By the time the interview wrapped, the real battle had already begun. Not in the studio, but online. Within minutes, social media platforms exploded with clips of Clint Eastwood's calm, cutting rebuttals. The hashtags #Clint Clapback, #Veronica owned, and #Eastwood and canceled shot to the top of trending lists worldwide. The comments were a firestorm of debate, some praising Eastwood for standing his ground, others accusing him of peddling outdated values. But the most shocking part? Even many of Veronica's usual supporters were acknowledging that, for once, she had met her match. Veronica sat in her dressing room, her phone vibrating incessantly with messages, notifications, and headlines that were already being crafted around the moment. The Guardian had already put out a piece titled, "Clint Eastwood Schools Liberal Host on Free Speech, a Lesson Decades in the Making." Meanwhile, the Huffington Post had taken the opposite angle. Clint Eastwood's dangerous rhetoric. Why we can't ignore his words. Every outlet was capitalizing on the moment, twisting it in their preferred direction. And Veronica? She was caught in the middle of a narrative she no longer controlled. Her producer, Jake, burst into the dressing room, his face a mixture of exhilaration and concern. "Veronica, this is insane," he said, holding up his tablet. "We've never had numbers like this before." The clip of Eastwood's Justice versus Revenge comment? 15 million views in under an hour. The full interview? It's climbing past 30 million. He exhaled sharply. "This is bigger than any interview we've ever done." Veronica rubbed her temples. "Bigger doesn't mean better, Jake," she muttered. "I lost control of the conversation." Jake shook his head. "No, you didn't. You created a moment. Look, some people are saying he made great points, sure, but others are furious. There are already think pieces dissecting his arguments, responses being drafted by activists, counter-articles going up. This is what we do, Veronica. We shape the conversation. And right now, this conversation is the biggest thing happening." Veronica wasn't sure whether to feel relieved or defeated. She had built her brand on winning debates, on exposing hypocrisy, on making guests squirm. But Clint Eastwood hadn't squirmed. He hadn't crumbled. He had stood his ground and, in doing so, turned her into the one on the defensive. And worse, he had done it without raising his voice, without condescension, without resorting to anger. She picked up her phone and scrolled through the endless tweets, articles, and opinion pieces forming around the event. Then she saw it. One tweet, simple yet devastating in its accuracy, that sent a jolt of unease through her. Veronica Hayes finally met someone she couldn't intimidate, and she didn't know what to do. She exhaled sharply, tossing the phone onto the counter. The truth was, she didn't have an answer for that. For the first time in her career, the story wasn't about her victory. It was about her loss. Veronica paced in her dressing room, the glow of her phone screen illuminating the tension in her face. The fallout from the interview wasn't just big, it was unprecedented. Every major news outlet, from conservative pundits to liberal think tanks, was dissecting the exchange. Some called it a wake-up call for modern media, others a humiliation for progressive discourse. But the worst part wasn't what others were saying, it was what her audience was saying. She had built her career on commanding the room, setting the narrative, and controlling the conversation. But this time, she hadn't controlled anything. Eastwood had flipped the script on her, and the internet wasn't letting her forget it. Jake reappeared at the doorway, his expression unreadable. "We need to respond," he said, closing the door behind him. "The network wants a statement. Damage control. They don't want this spinning too far out of our hands." Veronica scoffed, shaking her head. "Out of our hands? Jake, it's already out of our hands. He didn't just win that debate. He defined it. And now, instead of me being the progressive voice calling out the outdated views of an old Hollywood conservative, I'm the arrogant host who got humbled." She exhaled sharply. "I can already see the headlines." Jake sat down, rubbing his temples. "Look, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. This is a mess, but it's also an opportunity. If we frame it right, we can turn this into a conversation about power dynamics in media, about how public figures like Eastwood use their influence to push back against cultural accountability, He looked at her expectantly. You can control this, Veronica. You just have to take the narrative back. Veronica glanced at her phone, scrolling through the relentless storm of commentary. People were split, some praising Eastwood's calm demeanor, others questioning why she hadn't pushed back harder. The worst critiques weren't from conservatives. They were from her own side. She let him get away with it. She didn't challenge him enough. Where was the fire she usually brings? For the first time, she wasn't just being criticized by her ideological opponents. She was being abandoned by her allies. She clenched her jaw. We need a rebuttal, she said finally. Something smart, sharp. I'm not going to let him own the conversation. Jake nodded. Okay, we'll draft a follow-up segment. We can invite analysts, activists, people who can break down what he said and push back. Veronica tapped her fingers on the desk, thinking, no, that's too reactionary. It'll look desperate. I need to go bigger. She turned to Jake, her eyes blazing with renewed determination. I want another interview. Jake blinked. With who? Veronica smiled coldly. With Clint Eastwood. Jake stared at her, stunned. Are you serious? After what just happened? He's already won the internet, Veronica. Why give him another platform? She leaned forward. Because this time, I'll be ready. The morning after the interview, the media landscape was ablaze. Every major outlet had weighed in. Conservative platforms hailed Eastwood as the last bastion of unshaken masculinity in a world obsessed with outrage. Progressive commentators debated whether Veronica had failed to push back hard enough or if the tides of discourse were shifting in a way that couldn't be ignored. But the real firestorm was happening online. Memes flooded social media. Some depicted Eastwood as an old gunslinger, coolly taking down modern-day cancel culture warriors. Others mocked Veronica, framing her as a host who had finally met someone she couldn't bully. Hashtags like hashtag Clint versus cancel culture, hashtag Eastwood effect, and hashtag Veronica folded trended worldwide. Veronica scrolled through the chaos, her mind racing. This wasn't just a debate anymore. It was a moment. And if she wanted to survive it, she had to own it. She hit the record button on her phone, staring directly into the camera. Her voice was measured, her expression calculated. Yesterday, I sat down with Clint Eastwood for what turned out to be one of the most intense interviews of my career. I know a lot of you have opinions about what went down. Some of you think I went too easy on him. Some of you think he made great points. Others think I lost control of the conversation. Well, let's settle this properly. Mr. Eastwood, if you're watching, I'm inviting you back. Round 2. No scripts, no cuts, just a real, raw discussion about the future of discourse in this country. You said people need to listen. Well, let's see if you're willing to do the same. She hit upload. Within seconds, the video was being shared at an unprecedented rate. The comments section exploded. Oh damn, she's going for the rematch. Eastwood ain't gonna back down from this. If he refuses, it proves he got lucky the first time. This is the fight of the decade. The ball was in his court now. Jake burst into her office, phone in hand, eyes wide. Jesus, Veronica, do you realize what you just did? She smirked. Yeah, I just made this bigger than it already was. Jake ran a hand through his hair. If he says no, you win by default. If he says yes, Veronica's smile sharpened. Then I get another shot. Moments later, the inevitable happened. Clint Eastwood's official account, rarely active, tweeted just 4 words. Let's do it again. The internet went into meltdown. This wasn't just an interview anymore. It was a showdown. The studio was packed. The energy was different this time. Tighter, electric, like the moments before a high-stakes boxing match. The first interview had been a battle neither side had expected to escalate into a cultural phenomenon. But now it wasn't just an interview. It was an event. Every major news outlet was watching. Networks had sent analysts to prepare post-interview commentary. Online forums were in a frenzy, predicting whether Veronica would redeem herself or if Eastwood would deliver an even stronger blow. The stakes had never been higher. Veronica sat in her chair, her posture perfectly poised, her expression unreadable. She had spent days analyzing the first interview, dissecting every moment, consulting with strategists, refining her approach. This time, she wasn't going to get caught off guard. This time, she was going to control the conversation. Across from her, Clint Eastwood sat with the same unshaken demeanor as before. If he felt the weight of the moment, he didn't show it. There was no nervous energy, no eagerness to defend himself. Just the quiet confidence of a man who had spent his life standing firm in his beliefs. The cameras rolled. Veronica took a slow breath, then spoke. "Mr. Eastwood, welcome back." He nodded, his smirk barely visible. "Good to be back." She leaned forward, keeping her voice measured. "Let's not waste any time. The last time you were here, we had a conversation that ignited a nationwide debate. Some people think you made excellent points. Others think you dodged accountability. I invited you back because I want to go deeper. I want to ask the hard questions, and I want real answers." Eastwood chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Fair enough. But let's be clear. I don't dodge anything. You just didn't expect me to answer the way I did." The audience murmured. The tension was immediate. Veronica didn't hesitate. "Then let's start with the biggest question. You say cancel culture isn't about accountability. It's about control. But don't you think there are real consequences to speech? That words, especially from influential figures, can cause real harm?" Eastwood nodded slightly. "Sure, words have power. But power isn't the same as danger. We used to believe in countering speech with more speech, not with erasure. What changed?" Veronica leaned in. "What changed is that marginalized people finally have a voice. And when they call out the people who hold the power, people like you, they get labeled as overly sensitive or a part of some mob. But isn't that just another way to dismiss their struggle?" Eastwood's smirk faded. He studied her for a moment before replying. "See, that's the trick, isn't it? You frame it like it's about giving people a voice. But the truth is, it's about deciding which voices deserve to be heard. And when you start playing that game, it always backfires. The same people you empower today will be the ones silencing you tomorrow." The room was dead silent. Veronica held his gaze. "So you think all speech should be protected? Even hate speech?" Eastwood exhaled. "I think people need to stop assuming that disagreement is the same as hatred. That's the real problem. We've created a culture where the moment someone says something you don't like, you assume the worst. We don't talk anymore. We judge. We condemn. We destroy." He shook his head. "That's not progress. That's fear." The tension was suffocating. Veronica knew she had to push harder. This was her moment to prove she could take him on. But for the first time, she wasn't sure if winning this battle meant losing the war. And that terrified her. The studio was frozen in anticipation. The weight of the conversation had shifted from ideological sparring to something deeper, something raw. Veronica had expected resistance from Clint Eastwood, but what she hadn't anticipated was doubt. Not in him, but in herself. His words weren't just deflections. They carried an uncomfortable truth. But she wasn't ready to concede. She straightened her shoulders, her voice sharpening. "You talk about fear, but isn't that exactly what powerful figures say when they're being held accountable? When people push back against outdated ideas, it's not about fear, it's about progress." Eastwood's expression remained steady. "Progress?" he repeated, tilting his head slightly. "Or control?" He leaned forward, locking eyes with her. "You keep framing this as people pushing back, but tell me something. When does pushing back become pushing out? When does demanding accountability become demanding submission?" The words sent a ripple through the audience. Veronica hesitated for the briefest moment, then fired back. "So what's the alternative? Let anyone say anything, no matter how offensive or damaging, and just hope people will challenge it." Eastwood nodded. "Exactly. Because once you start deciding what can and can't be said, you aren't fighting oppression. You're becoming it." The room was silent. Veronica felt her pulse quicken. This wasn't the way these debates usually played out. She was supposed to be the one holding the moral high ground. But instead, she felt like she was teetering on the edge of something she didn't fully understand. She exhaled, gripping the edge of her desk. "So let me ask you this. If words shouldn't be censored, then what's your solution? What do we do when people use their platforms to spread hate, misinformation, division? Just let it happen." Eastwood's expression didn't change. "You don't stop bad ideas by silencing them. You stop them by exposing them, by challenging them, by proving them wrong." But the second you try to erase them, you only make them stronger. He leaned back, his voice calm but firm. People trust the truth when they find it, not when it's forced on them. A single clap echoed from the back of the audience. Then another. Then, before anyone could stop it, the studio erupted into applause. Not a partisan cheer, not the forced enthusiasm of an audience conditioned to respond, but something real. Something unexpected. Veronica swallowed. For the first time in her career, she wasn't sure if she wanted to win, because she wasn't sure if she could. The applause faded, leaving behind an unfamiliar silence, one thick with introspection. This wasn't the triumphant moment Veronica had envisioned. She hadn't dismantled Clint Eastwood. She hadn't exposed him as outdated or out of touch. Instead, he had done something far more dangerous. He had made people think. The interview wrapped moments later, with Eastwood standing to shake her hand. "Thanks for the conversation," he said, his voice even. Not smug, not victorious, just genuine. Veronica shook his hand, her grip firm, but her mind racing. "Likewise," she replied, but even as she said it, she knew something had shifted inside her. As Eastwood left the stage, the audience remained seated, processing what had just unfolded. Some were visibly uncomfortable. Some were energized. Some seemed unsure of what to believe anymore. And that was the real victory, the fallout. By the time Veronica reached her dressing room, the internet had already exploded. The interview was being dissected in real time. Clips of Eastwood's most powerful lines were being shared across platforms. But something was different this time. It wasn't just his words being analyzed, it was hers. Some were applauding her for engaging in a real, unfiltered debate. Others accused her of failing to hold him accountable. And then there were those who saw something else entirely. Is it just me? Or did Veronica actually start questioning herself? This wasn't a takedown. This was a masterclass in real discussion. For the first time, I feel like I actually learned something from an interview. No matter where you stand, this is what conversations should look like. Veronica stared at the comments, her chest tightening. She had expected to either dominate the conversation or become the villain in it. But this was something else. Jake rushed in, out of breath, phone in hand. "Veronica, we need to talk." She looked up at him. "Let me guess. Network backlash?" Jake shook his head. "No, the opposite." He flipped his phone around, showing a flood of notifications. "They want more. They want this format, real, raw debates. No scripted outrage, no gotcha moments. Just this." Veronica blinked. "Wait, they want me to do more of this?" Jake grinned. "You just changed the game?" That night, as Veronica sat alone in her apartment, staring at the ceiling, she realized something unsettling. For years, she had been so certain, so convinced that her job was to win debates, to expose people, to shape the narrative. But Clint Eastwood hadn't just challenged her on air. He had challenged her beliefs, her assumptions, the very way she had built her career. And for the first time in a long time, she wasn't sure if she had been right all along. The story wasn't about victory or defeat anymore. It was about growth. And maybe, just maybe, that was the real lesson after all. If you made it this far, comment where you're watching from and let us know if the story of justice moved you.